Okay, here we go. What I want to do is a piece in which we're going to be looking at an animal that's partially in, partially out of the water, and partially under the water. So I'm going to go with kind of a classical approach to the lake monster, which is more of the snaky, eely kind of thing. And what I'm doing now is just sort of roughing in the shape of what I want to be doing. And what I'm going to have is a lake monster who is coming up on the beach, so that we can play with forms that are wet, coming out of the water, forms that are under the water, and forms that are just peeking up out of the water. Now, lakes, of course, do not have tides the way that the ocean does. There's usually wave action connected with a lake. But what I'm going to do is have kind of a rocky beach here, a little bit of a broken conifer tree here to frame the picture a little bit. And a large rock in the foreground to frame that off. And I don't want to give him a traditional snaky kind of head. I want to give him a weird kind of cross between a canine head and a serpentine head. So I'm going to play with a form here that may or may not work out, but we'll see. Okay. Now, typically I would go in with much tighter pencils, but since we're doing this as a demo, I'm just going to jump in and trust to my ability to save this drawing. Okay, now I don't know how well you can see the pencils on the projector. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. So what I want to do first is, as I do with the marker drawings, I'm going to begin by delineating the forms that are heaviest in shadow or at the bottom of a form, so that I can go in with a little bit of weight to the line. And as you can see, I'm taking a fair amount more care than I do when I work with the markers, because I got to live with these lines. And also working with the brush, it's a much finer tool and capable of way more subtle line work than I can get with a marker. Markers are dead lines to me, and to me brush line is probably the most alive type of line. Some pens, especially flexible pen nibs, you can get a very lifelike line, but with brushes I can really control the width of the line. It's just got a lot more life to it, whereas a marker is inherently, to my mind, like a dead line. I can't really control the thick and thin when I'm drawing with a marker, because a marker only has one thickness. I can toy with it a little bit by turning the marker a bit on edge or on its side or that sort of thing, but nothing like what I can get with a brush. Now, you may notice that I'm starting to get more of a dry brush look now. That's because the ink that had been loaded into this pen is running out, but I continue drawing because I'm getting very fine line work at this point, and I like drawing with that finer line. And then finally, I'm just not getting anything. Yeah, that's not too bad of a face. I don't know if I write home about it, but okay. Now, because he's coming up on a rocky beach, I don't want to go drawing his underbelly, because it's the rocks and the stones on the beach that are going to delineate where his body is resting. So I'm delineating the bottom of his form by working with those stone textures.
What kind of brush are you working
I am working with a number 2 watercolor brush. It's got a fine enough point for the work that I'm doing, but it also holds enough ink that I'm able to get a pretty lengthy drawing session each time I dip in the ink and then jump in. My preference are the Series 7 watercolor brushes, and I usually work with a number 3 and 4. But I thought, for the purposes of this demo, I'd bring in something finer than that so that there'd be more contrast with the marker drawings I was doing a moment ago. Okay, I'm stopping this line right at the edge of the water. And I'm going to put a little bit of, all right, this is going to be where we're going to be working with the edge of the water. And in this case, I'm working with a form that's almost tube-like. This is a big, fat, serpentine creature. So the ripple and the shape of it going into the water is going to be an ellipse that I'm looking at from the side. And the one other part where I want to have this fellow coming up out of the water is over here. Let me delineate that now, just so I know what I'm working to. Okay. Now, let me do a little bit more here. Let me give him one of those strange... There aren't many reptiles in nature that actually have crests or spinal features like this, but it's traditional with lake monsters and sea monsters to give them something. So I'll stick with tradition for the purpose of this drawing. Now you see that I'm doing my lines to try to describe the form. I want to make this guy look like there's weight, that the form bends around. Go. And I'm putting a little more spin on it here because I want to have that feeling of his form kind of flattening out a little bit where it's touching the rocky beach. And I'll do more with that once I go in with whiteout in a bit. And you can see my brush is starting to dry out a little, but that's fine. Okay, that works pretty well. Now I want to lay in some heavy shadow around him, and this is a tough call. He's kind of leaning his head forward, so the shadow would actually fall over part of his body, but I don't want to confuse the form too much. So I'm going to lay the shadow on the rock behind him and use that to delineate that part of what he's doing. But it is a cheat. I should technically have it falling over his body, but I think that would confuse his form too much. And go ahead and shout out questions if you got them, because that's why I'm doing this. I'm now letting the dry brush, part of why I like working with watercolor paper is it's got a tooth and you can see how it's breaking the line up. And I like that because it's giving me more textures than I could get if I were working with a smooth tooth paper. All right, now up here I'm going to have a broken tree. I'm going to go in really bold at this point.